So Jolyon Hallows, author of A Parkinson's Life and a Caregiver's Roadmap, is a published author and authority on project management. His connection to Parkinson's disease began when his wife, Sandra, was diagnosed with the disease and he became her caregiver. His book deals with Sandra's struggles with the disease and his struggles to become a caregiver. He's given numerous presentations on caregiving for the Parkinson Society of BC and at the National Caregiving Conference in Chicago. And he's here today as a volunteer for the Family Caregivers of BC and has kindly agreed to give us this presentation on self-care for caregivers. So thank you so much for being here.
Oh, you're welcome, Rochelle, and thank you for the introduction. I was going to say about myself all of the things that you just said, so I no longer have to repeat them. Yeah, my wife was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in October of 1996, about 25 years ago, and I became her caregiver. Now, I had no idea what that meant. Initially, all it involved was sometimes helping her up out of an easy chair, or when we went walking and held hands, it was increasingly a sign of support than just affection. But Parkinson's is progressive, and over time, she deteriorated, got worse. She passed away in May of 2017, about 4.5 years ago. And for the last few years of her life, she needed help in everything: dressing, feeding, personal hygiene, everything, you name it. As Rochelle mentioned, I've written this book, A Parkinson's Life and the Caregiver's Roadmap. It's part memoir dealing with her struggles with the disease, and it's part of how-to guide for caregivers. Now, one of the, I hate to say advantages of something like Parkinson's, but one of the characteristics is that it's a slow-moving disease. She had it for over 20 years. I know that there are some people who are thrust into caregiving in an instant through accident or medical emergency. And I really feel sorry for these people. They don't have the time, the luxury that I had to adapt to caregiving. So I'm hoping that in this course or in this talk tonight, I can convey some of the things that I've learned about caregiving. As Rochelle mentioned, if you have any questions during the presentation, I'll be happy to answer them, and there'll be a Q&A at the end. So I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation. So let me share the screen here. Okay, does everyone see that? Okay. Presentation here, the focus tonight is taking care of yourself. We're talking about self-care for caregivers. And what we're going to be covering, just a minute, let me get myself organized here. What we're going to be covering is the importance of support and getting support in caregiving. I'll be asking you, what is your current level of self-care? How are you doing at looking after yourself? We'll talk about self-compassion and support networks and resilience. And we're going to end with a discussion on where do we go from here? How do you look after yourself? It's one thing for people like me to stand up and say you have to look after yourself. It's quite another thing when you're in the midst of the caregiving process to find time and the energy to do it. So we'll be talking about some techniques for that. I'm here representing the Family Caregivers of BC. It's a nonprofit charity dedicated to family caregivers. And there are three focuses here. Caregiver support provides direct support to caregivers through support groups and counseling and one-on-one help. Education, we offer a library, webinars, podcasts, newsletters, and so on to help people become more familiar with caregiving. And collaboration particularly with the government and with government agencies to bring caregiving. issues to the fore. Sorry?
Sorry, somebody just entered and their mic was unmuted. You're good to go.
I'm good to go. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's who we are. Now, the question comes is, what is a family caregiver? And there's a definition here. My answer is a family caregiver is someone who looks after someone who needs it. It could be short term. Maybe you're a caregiver for a period of time when someone has some sort of illness or disease or accident and then recovers. But more typically, it's someone who looks after someone who is not going to recover and who is going to decline. And that's really the issue here. We talk about family caregivers, but I've known caregivers who aren't family members at all. They're friends, helping friends. So we call them family caregivers, but it's actually anyone who's looking after somebody else. And this is important, on an unpaid basis. We don't get paid for this. So what's the relationship of a caregiver? Well, this is not a simple question to answer. And when I hear people talking about the caregiver relationship, I hear a lot of words like love and respect and caring. But I've known caregivers who didn't really like the people they were caring for. So why were they looking after them? Well, duty. I swore in sickness and in health till death do us part, and I made that oath, so I'm going to do it. Maybe it's financial, because of the way the family's finances are structured. People can't afford to not do the caregiving. Or maybe it's of the hope of gain. If I look after my maiden aunt, maybe she'll remember me in her will. My point is that there are many, many reasons for giving care, and there are many different caregiver relationships. And none of them are any better or worse than any other, but it's not as simple as just someone who cares for someone else, who loves someone else, giving care. It's far more complex than that. How big is the caregiving community? Well, right now there's about 8 million Canadians giving care, offered unpaid care for families, friends, and neighbors. In BC, here in BC, there's about almost 1.4 million. And one very disturbing statistic is that about a quarter of Canadians between the ages of 15 and 19 are caregivers for parents, particularly usually parents. These are young caregivers, and they have their own set of problems, as you can imagine. What do family caregivers do? Well, here's some statistics on various aspects of it, but my answer is caregivers do whatever the caree needs. Maybe it's driving to a medical appointment. Maybe it's cleaning after a bowel movement. It's whatever the caree needs. And the moment what I realized is that the moment I come upon something that a care that my wife needed, that I wouldn't provide, not that I couldn't provide, but that I wouldn't provide, I was no longer a caregiver. I was picking and choosing, and I can't do that. Well, I could not do that. The caree's needs are determined by the caree alone. My wife's needs were determined by her condition, by her situation. I have no say in it. And that leads to various issues, because caregivers are busy people, but we have lives before this came along. And all of a sudden we're thrust into the need to add a whole bunch of extra tasks to our daily life. And that means that what ends up is a growing problem of caregiver distress. There's a report of the Seniors Advocate report this is in BC. 31% of caregivers report being in distress, which means by distress, the caregiver burden, the extent to which caregivers perceive that caregiving is an adverse effect on them. And I would alter this definition. I would take out the words perceive. So the extent to which caregiving has had an adverse effect, because to me, it's not a matter of perception, it's real. And it's not something that you can say, oh, it's all in your mind. This is real. So the kinds of characteristics that caregiver distress presents is overload and exhaustion, people trying to do it all and not asking for help. I'll be talking about this much later. Complex family dynamics. There are conflicts within families, difficult conversations, feeling isolated. One of the problems that caregivers often face is that, okay, because of the demands upon their time, something has to go. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, what goes is social interaction. And that's the last thing. Well, I'll talk about more about support networks later on, but that's the last thing that should go. Grief. During the time that my wife had her Parkinson's, I could see her, I was losing her. Not physically, but I was losing her. She was no longer the woman that I fell in love with and that I married. And that's a sense of loss. That was grief, and it was ongoing, and it was a drag. Financial and legal concerns. I used to do a lot of work out of town. I had to give that up because I couldn't leave town. I couldn't leave her alone. And of course, working my way through the healthcare system and figuring out how that worked, that's a challenge in itself. So all of these problems come about in various ways in terms of stress, like anger, social withdrawal, depression, exhaustion. I suspect that many of you can identify with a lot of these characteristics. But the bottom line is that it affects your health. The chronic health conditions among identified caregivers is twice the rate of the general population. Things like depression. And when I say depression, I don't mean sadness. I mean clinical depression, something that has to be treated. Hypertension, back injuries from transferring people who can't transfer themselves. So the caregiver burden has a huge impact upon people's health. And when we talk to caregivers, and I know there's speak of being on the edge of depression, of burnout, of injury, of needing a break. You're sort of on the cusp of I won't say collapsing, but certainly sometimes it feels that way. And doing all that on top of the other stuff of work, career, being a parent, belonging to social organizations. And the third thing is a sense of being on the outside. I would take my wife to a doctor, and the doctor would, of course, he would spend his whole time examining her, which, I mean, but that makes sense. That's reasonable. But nobody ever asked me how I was doing. And I felt on the outside. I felt sort of excluded, as though the care team was something doing their own thing, and I was sort of incidental to the cause. And I was suggesting that caregivers need to be part of the care team, and sometimes that means pushing your way into it and changing the culture. So the care team is doctors, nurses, care aides, therapists, social workers. Well, it should also include caregivers, because caregivers are key to looking after the person who's got the disease. So you might want to ask yourself, how is my current self-care? And I'll be talking about in more detail about how to accomplish that, or how to move tactics to move into self-care. What's my degree of resilience? How resilient am I? Where do I need support? Where do I turn? Okay, so that's the problem. Taking care of yourself. Let's look at what to do about it. Self-care. And here's the key. I can say Okay, you need to look after yourself. But I have no idea what that means because I don't know what you mean by looking after yourself. So this is something you have to identify. What do you mean by self-care? It could be something as simple as taking a walk or having a lunch with a friend. It could mean something longer term, like taking a course or going to a weekend convention of some sort. What is comforting for you? And how do we accomplish that? So self-care is a way of looking, it's a way of looking after yourself. And I'll be digging into that as we go. It's not necessarily self-improvement. It's important to note that it's to help you meet your own needs. So how do we accomplish self-care? It's all well and good to talk about it, but it's all sort of at the 50,000-foot level. How do you actually look after yourself? What are the techniques? Well, here are some strategies, and I'll be talking about these as we go. But self-compassion, what does that mean? I'll be talking about connection with other people and personal supports, bringing balance into your caregiving. I'll talk about resiliency, how to recover, how to bounce back, and finally, an action plan. So let's look at each of these. We'll start with self-compassion. What do I mean by self-compassion? Well, if I had to define it in a single sentence, it would be stop beating up on yourself. We all make mistakes. Certainly I did. And I'd feel guilty about it, and that would make me feel worse. And then I'd begin to question my own ability to do this. So here's a tactic that I offer. If you find yourself blaming yourself for something you've done, maybe you got angry, maybe you forgot to do something, maybe you flew off the handle, I don't know, something that you feel guilty about. Here's a tactic. Imagine that you're looking from the outside at somebody else who's in the same situation you are, a caregiver looking after someone, looking after a caree. And that person, that caregiver that you're looking at, makes the mistake you made. What would your reaction be? My best guess is that your reaction would be, well, it's understandable. It's part of the situation. Everybody makes mistakes. This is forgivable. Okay, well, if you can forgive somebody else for making this mistake, why can you not forgive yourself? So what I mean by self-compassion is recognize that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have problems. And it's a question of just recognizing that and being kind to yourself when you make that judgment. Connection. One of the things that goes, I find, in a lot of caregivers is social connections. Most of us, we have social connections. We've got friends, we belong to organizations, whether they're church organizations or social clubs or whatever. We belong to various organizations and we socialize because we're a social species. But what happens with caregiving is that people back away from socialization, partly because they're tired, they just haven't got the energy to do it, partly because they can't face the continual questions of how's your wife doing, and partly because you don't want people to see you when you're not at your best, and when you're caregiving you're not at your best, so you back away. You back away from socialization, and that is one of the worst things you can do. You need that contact. You need that's connections. One of the things that will happen is friends will say to you, "Can I help?" I'll be willing to bet that for most of you, When someone says, how can I help? Can I help? The answer is, oh, I'm okay. Yeah, don't worry about it. I'm doing fine. That's fine. No, that's not what you want to do. Here's a tactic that I suggest. When someone asks, can I help? Then you have a request in your back pocket to put to them. So is there any, can I help? Well, actually, yes, there is. You make a killer casserole. I really like that casserole. And tomorrow I'm really swamped. Can I ask you to make a casserole and bring it over tomorrow night? Because it would really help me with dinner. Or on Thursday, I want to go to a course, but I need someone to sit with my wife or my husband while I'm gone, just to make sure nothing happens. Are you free then? Can you come and do this for me? You'll get two kinds of answers. One is, oh, I'd love to, but I can't do it tomorrow or on Thursday because I'm really busy. But please call upon me whenever you need me. My advice, stroke them off your list. Not necessarily with friends or acquaintances, but stroke them off your list as people you can rely on to help. On the other hand, there will be people who say, absolutely, I'll bring over a casserole whenever you want. Absolutely, I'll be happy to sit with you, with your wife. Assuming that I'm free, then just give me a call. Those are the people you can rely upon. Those are the people who will help. The other place to look is community organizations for help. I'm in Burnaby, BC, and here we have, there's a couple of organizations, several actually. There's Burnaby Home Care that provides care aides to come in for respite care. There's Burnaby, there's something called Burnaby Neighborhood House that offers programs for seniors, or the local community center has exercise programs for seniors, sometimes even chair exercises for people who can't stand. So find out what's available in the community. Respite care. So if you want to do something for a few days, you can put your care in respite care for a few days, or a day program. One of the things you need to do is to figure out what your community offers. Support groups. If there is one piece of advice, if I only had 5 minutes to talk and could only give one piece of advice, this would be it. Attend a support group. I'm going to say something here that this is not advice. I'm not advising that. I'm not suggesting you do this at all. But it's what I did when I was looking after my wife. Many caregivers find a lot of support among family and friends. I never looked for that. I did not look for support among family and friends, not because I didn't think they provided. I'm pretty sure they would have, but because I didn't want them to become surrogate caregivers for me. I didn't want my brother to pick up the phone to call me and think, yeah, I'm really not in the mood for another litany of problems, and hang up. Now, please, I'm not offering this as advice. I'm not suggesting you do it. The reason I bring it up is that I suspect that some of you feel the same way. And when you hear other caregivers talk about all the support they're getting from family and friends, you may be tempted to think there's something wrong with me. There's not. It's just your particular approach. That was my approach, and I'm not suggesting it's better or worse than any other, but it is one more approach. When you look for a caregiver support group, here in BC, family caregivers offer caregiver support groups. A lot of the disease-specific organizations offer caregiver support groups. Certainly, Prostate Care does, Parkinson's does, and so on. If you look for a caregiver support group, make sure that it's a caregiver support group, not a support group for people with the condition. Because in the support group, you are going to talk about things that you do not want people with the condition to hear. That's what you need to discuss. I'll give you an example. I'd had a particularly rough day, both my wife and I. It was hard, and I was just about the end of my tether. I was in despair. I was angry, and the thought crossed my mind: it would be better for both of us if she passed away. Now, this is a terrible thing to think about someone you love. I could never have mentioned that to my family or friends. But when I mentioned it in the support group, everybody nodded. Yep, been there, done that. So it gave me some validation that I wasn't some sort of monster, that there was, this is a part of the condition. So my advice, find a caregiver support group. And one more hint, by the way, there's a difference between a caregiver support group and an information session. You'll find that sometimes people come in for to give presentations, and there'll be 25 to 35 people in a presentation. Those are valuable. Those are very useful, but they're not support groups. The support group is small, typically 6 to 8 people, enough time for everybody to go around and talk about their own position, their own condition. And of course, everything is confidential. So that is one piece of advice that I really suggest. Your circle of support, people that you can tap into, people that you can, people who make that casserole, people who will be willing to help. And the bigger that circle is, the easier your caregiving journey will be. The other part of personal support is asking for help. Now, if there is one piece of advice that people who talk about caregiving offer that is universally taught and universally ignored, it is this: ask for help. Why? I mean, it makes sense. Why would people ignore this? Well, I look back upon my own experience, and I never asked for help. Why? Because I'm a man. I've been taught to look after myself. I can handle my own problems. Real men don't need no help. It was that type of attitude that prevented me from going out and asking for help. And when I reflected back on this, I thought, well, that's a male problem. Women certainly would ask for help. And then I talked to women caregivers, and I got the same response. No, because the women I talked to said, we don't like asking for help either. Why? You don't have this macho affliction that men have got. Well, no, said one woman, but I'm supposed to be a caregiver. I'm supposed to be a nurturer. If I have to ask for help in this, I'm a failure. So for men, asking for help is a sign of weakness. For women, it's a sign of failure. And the result is that help rarely gets asked for. So I'm going to put a different spin on this, okay? I reached the point in my caregiving journey that I knew I had reached the end. I could not handle this anymore. I needed help. So I hired a care aide. Her name was Melissa. And I was really concerned. Melissa, she wouldn't know how to look after my wife. She wouldn't know what my wife wanted. I had to babysit her through this. Well, this was one of the more humbling experiences of my life, because in the next couple of days, I realized that Melissa was giving my wife better care than I ever did. She was moving her through range of motion exercises that I didn't know what they were. She was experimenting with different foods, because my wife was getting to be a very picky eater. And as it turns out, Melissa made a killer egg salad sandwich that my wife couldn't get enough of. Melissa was looking for potential medical problems like bed sores. Well, I didn't know how to look for a bed sore. And she called it pampering. I called it woman stuff. It was lotions and creams and all that sort of stuff. I had no idea what was involved, what that meant. And the result is that Melissa gave my wife better care than I ever did. And I'm not beating myself up when I say that. I'm not criticizing myself. She should have given better care than I did because she's a professional. I'm an amateur. And when I got her help, I was getting the help of someone who knew what they were doing. So here's the twist I want to put on this. I wish that earlier in my caregiving, someone had said people kept saying to me, you got to get help. You got to look after yourself. You know, you can't afford to crash. You've got to look after yourself, so you got to look after your wife. I wish someone had said to me, listen, bozo, it isn't about you. It's about your wife. It's about getting her the best possible help because you're an amateur. You can't do it. So if someone had said that, it's a hypothetical, so I don't know how I would have responded in reality. But I like to think that I would have thought, okay, maybe I will ask for help. And if I had done that a few years earlier, my wife would have had better care. The other advantage of getting in help is that it relieved a lot of the pressure from me as a caregiver, and it allowed me to spend more time as a husband. So get help. That's the bottom line here. Balancing the demands of caring for someone else while taking care of yourself. At some point, I had a bit of a medical issue. I had to go in for some tests and so on. Turned out to be nothing serious, but I had some friends who were shocked. They said, you can't get sick. Who will take care of Sandra? And I thought, gee, thanks. What about me? And you need to spend this time looking at taking care of yourself because we all need to spend time caring for ourselves. To me, there's no difference between a caregiver who doesn't look after himself or herself and a workaholic who doesn't spend the time looking after themselves. You need to take time to look after your own well-being. And that's easier said than done. But one of the keys to this is called resiliency. Resiliency is, well, the example here is a twig. If you bend it, it springs back instead of a dead twig, which snaps. But resiliency is, how do you bounce back? How do you recover from a difficult situation? And there's been a lot written on resiliency, but to me, it comes down to one single question. Here's a tactic that I suggest, and that it's worked for me. You have a rough day. Things have just gone off the rails. You're angry, you're frustrated, you're in despair. Okay, let the emotions play out. Don't suppress them, let them play out. But once they played out, ask this question. Now what? What do I do now? And that question changes the focus from everything that went wrong and what's causing me to feel so bad to, all right, what's the next step? Maybe it'll be hard to come up with something to do, but just the change of focus helps you restore yourself, helps you recover from that. So resiliency is this ability to in effect bounce back from a difficult situation, to recover rather than to let it defeat you. So here's a question. How resilient do you feel? And can you see yourself asking this question? Can you see yourself saying, okay, what do I do now? And then trying various techniques to move forward. Taking action. here, according to the slides, it's vital for you to be able to identify and advocate for your own needs. But there's an assumption here, there's a precursor. That is, what are your own needs? So here's a question. And I asked this question of caregivers, what do you want? The answer I typically get back is, it doesn't matter what I want, I haven't got time to do it. No, that's not what I'm asking. I'm asking what you want. How you get it is a totally different question. We'll come to that in a minute. But what do you want? It could be something like, well, I'd love to take that course that I saw on Middle Eastern cooking or pottery. I'd love to go for a round of golf, but that's 2 or 3 hours and I just don't have the time. I'd like to go to that weekend writers conference or the hang gliding jamboree. That's what I want, but I haven't got time to do it. Okay, but I'm not interested in how you get there. I'm only interested initially in what do you want? Now that you've got it, now that you've identified what you want, now you can say, how can you get it? What are the things that you can do to have your caree looked after while you do what you want? For example, I found a day program. I put my wife into a day program. I drop her off at 10 in the morning and pick her up at 3 in the afternoon. And I go out and play a round of golf. Now, here's a trap when you start to look after yourself. The trap is guilt. The first round of golf I played, I felt guilty every step of the way because she loved to play golf too. And we played this course many times. And I just felt guilty being out there by myself, trying to enjoy the course without her being there with me. But it was something that I needed to do. And over time, as things progressed, I began to discover that she was quite enjoying the day program. They had recreation, games, they had good meals. And the guilt began to fade. And you have to work through this. This is a problem. When you're working on what you want, you have to work through that guilt so that it settles down and you can pursue whatever it is you're looking for. So the end of all this is an action plan. You need to figure out, okay, what steps can I do? So take some time, maybe in the evening after your caree's gone to bed, or maybe in the afternoon when they're having a nap or something. Take some time for yourself and say, okay, just ask yourself, here's what I want. What are some things I can do to get there? You don't need to put priorities on them or figure out how you're going to do them. Just what are they? What are the steps to getting where I want to get? And then focus on one step at a time, something that can be accomplished in a day or even a week, keeping it short term, and that moves you towards it. And the important point here is that it puts focus on looking after yourself. It puts focus on your goals, upon the things you want. Yes, I would love to have had my wife playing golf with me, but that was never going to happen. That doesn't mean that I couldn't go out and do it. And that doesn't mean that I couldn't go out and enjoy it. So taking that action, taking those steps was critical. So here we go. What stressor would you like to reduce? What source of energy would you like more of? What would give it to you? And then write down one self-care focus. What small action can you do this week? And here are the key questions. What will you do? How much of it will you do? When will you do it? How often will you do it? And by the way, one more point here is if you, let's say that you want to go to a course, you want to register for a course. You think, well, I'd like to register for the course. It's on Tuesday evenings from 7 till 8 in the evening. I'll see if I can arrange something for my wife then. And if I can, then I'll register for the course. No, backwards. register for the course, pay for it. Now you have some commitment, and now you have some motivation to find someone to look after your wife. Maybe you won't be able to. I've had to abandon courses that I've had because things didn't work out. But the fact that I made the commitment first gave me more impetus to solve the problem. That is the end of my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you in BC, you can look at the family caregiver supports. I do know there's branches of family caregivers in other provinces, and unfortunately, I don't have a list of them. But if you go to their website, Family Caregivers of BC, then they will that'll point you in whatever is the equivalent in your province. And even if you want to give them a call, they may well have information about similar organizations in wherever you happen to be. But give them a call because they're there to help. And I just want to say that you're all caregivers, and I know what a tough job this is. And as far as I'm concerned, you guys are all heroes. You deserve a round of applause for things that you do. So thank you for your attention. And I'm going to stop the share now, and we can go to the Q&A.